All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Today we are jumping into our fifth webinar in this series for vendors. Excuse me. I will put the link to the slide deck in the chat. There we go. And the shortcut link is also here on this first slide. Good grief, excuse me. go.ncdpi.gov/access vendors collab. And so if you've been able to join us to this point or any of the previous webinars, this is kind of the recap. And in the presentation slide, I have a link to all of the slide decks from these webinars. Excuse me, again. I actually have on the Digital Accessibility YouTube channel, I have 3 of those posted. I still have last week's still to post. I'm finishing cleaning up that transcript. But currently 3 of those are already linked, and I'll show you where that link is to the YouTube channel when we get to the end of today's session, and I'm pointing out the digital accessibility website. So far, we have talked about just an introduction to digital accessibility, talking about related laws and just some basic general strategies for digital accessibility, and thinking about it through the lens of being a supplier of solutions for educational organizations and then other state and local governments. And then the next 2 webinars were really about kind of addressing the current landscape of accessibility, not only around the lens of compliance, but also around a culture of commitment. And then the following webinar was about, then what? We've assessed where we currently are, so how do we make a game plan for moving forward? And then last week, we did a deep dive into the VPAT, or also known as an Accessibility Conformance Report. So making sure that we understood kind of the ins and outs of effective communication through a VPAT, and really what procurement teams are looking for when they're looking at your conformance report. So that's been the recap so far. I haven't introduced myself. If this is your first webinar in the series, welcome again. And I am Donna Murray. I serve as the first ever digital accessibility specialist at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. I've been with the agency for about 11 years, really focused in all things digital learning, with a keen focus on digital content. And so in that work over the past, I'd say 4 or 5 years, I've really been focused on digital accessibility, and have been honored to shift into this new role about 1.5 years ago. So in that work, I have really realized what I believe is a critical component to moving forward with digital accessibility, and that is a partnership with vendors. I truly believe that in order for us to really have the momentum that we need to move forward with digital accessibility, we have to have frank, transparent conversations between ed organizations, state and local government organizations, and their suppliers. We're all learning. This is not a process that happens overnight, and it's going to be ongoing. So the more that we can have these open conversations about, here's what we need, here's what our users are saying, and hearing from vendors on challenges that they may be facing, or progress that they have made thus far, and what their roadmap is, to me, that is just a critical component of moving forward to ensure that we're removing barriers for everyone. So yes, there are laws that really are driving this conversation around compliance. And there are some new rules from 2024 for the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, as well as for Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And yes, compliance is very important, but this is also about collaborating to have a partnership on that commitment. And it's really about a commitment for growth as well as compliance. So this is kind of a recap of where we've been so far. And today's conversation is really going to dive into that collaborative effort. What could it look like? What are the different components about that collaboration? What are some potential barriers that we may face? I'm also going to share some insights where I've done a deep dive into federal government agencies and some requirements that they have around accessibility to kind of learn from some of the lessons that they've learned over the past few years when it comes to meeting those requirements and what partnerships, collaboration have looked like for them and what's been successful. So we'll try to glean some lessons from that that whole process. And then we'll even talk about today how you as a vendor can lead the way for this collaboration. So let's jump in. I really want to frame the topic before we jump in by making a couple important points. One, this again is not just about compliance. We're not going to just be talking about VPATs. Obviously, that's important. We need to talk about compliance. But today's conversation is really going to be focused on that partnership and how to build that trust, how to really improve usability for everyone, and how through partnerships we can mitigate some of those risks, not just legal ones, but also risks that are, really user focused. If we're not collaborating, we're running the risk of really not meeting our user needs. So that's kind of how we're going to approach today's topic. But I do want to mention that the goal of this conversation today is not about shifting responsibility. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have, a legal contract with a customer. We're going to have some clearly defined expectations for who's going to be responsible for accessibility, as well as all the other things that are included in our service level agreements. And we're going to have some clear lines in the sand on who's responsible for what, and not just with resources but also with funding. So this isn't about shifting that responsibility. Our conversation today is that kind of that nuanced space of how can we work together to benefit both our teams and to benefit end users. When I talk about collaboration, I say that it is a win-win. And certainly, we're going to have some language within our procurement and our implementation processes that kind of hold our feet to the fire, both as a customer as well as the vendor, obviously, to say these are the expectations that have to be met. And this isn't about shifting that conversation. This is about how, in and among those conversations, those contractual conversations, how can we also coordinate our efforts to improve the user experiences. So that's kind of the disclaimer to our conversation today, knowing that everybody's relationship with customers, as well as just the full scope of a vendor's company and what their priorities are and what products they're making, that's going to vary tremendously. So as I've said in previous webinars, take what you need from any of the content that I'm sharing and remix it to meet your needs. So if you go through today's session or any previous session and you see that the resource that I've created that corresponds with that content is not helpful, then take it, make it yours, remix it, delete, start over, tear it apart and put it back together in ways that fit your needs. All right, so let's jump in and talk about what I have identified are some different types of collaboration. I do have a resource document that corresponds with this, and if you've been attending any of the other webinars, you'll this structure will look similar. So I've already added these to my website in the vendors section, and this is kind of the deeper dive into these different types of collaboration. We're not going to cover everything, but I want to give you an idea of the structure of this content and give you an example of each of these types of collaboration. And so that's what's included in our slide deck. So let's jump into that strategic collaboration. This is really about strategy. You know, have we aligned our goals between a vendor and a customer? Do we have a clear understanding of what our timelines are? Are we really focused on kind of a shared discussion, some planning where we're sitting down together and talking about, here's kind of our long range plan, here are our goals around accessibility and what we're looking to down the road. Now, I've mentioned that this does not happen overnight, especially if we haven't been talking about accessibility since the beginning of the design phase for our products, or as an ed or government organization, if we've not been talking about accessibility for a long time, then we're probably having to do a lot of remediation. We're having to kind of audit and inventory to see what is our current landscape and how are we going to improve, how are we going to build capacity and make sure everybody has the training they need. That's not going to happen overnight. So that's another reason this type of collaboration is so important. Let's talk about what are our goals, what are we, what's our long range and our short range plans, and let's share those so that we're on the same page about where we are in the journey. So this is just a quick view. This is, again, included in that resource document. This is just kind of a quick view looking at what this looks like, what happens when we don't have it, and then kind of a guiding question for our conversations and those collaborative conversations. So this is just an example of strategic collaboration. If we have opportunities, we want to have conversations around what does success look like. So again, through the lens of our contractual language that we have, what does success look like, and what are the roles and responsibilities for that? What's on the shoulders of the organization themselves? What's on the shoulders of the vendor? And how can we collaborate to ensure we're on the same page? Otherwise, we could absolutely be working towards different goals and not even realize it. So the more open we have those conversations, the more transparent we are in those conversations, the more aligned we're going to be in our plans. And so a guiding question for that could be as simple as, what's the roadmap look like? What are our goals over the next year, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, and see how we can align those goals. And see if there's an opportunity for us to revise those to be, more on the same page with that roadmap. All right, the next type of collaboration is really about that day-to-day work. So the strategy, the strategic collaboration is kind of that big picture plan. The operational collaboration is really identifying ways that we can coordinate the day-to-day work. Like what does this look like? How do we align our workflows to ensure that our users have what they need? So here's a quick view for that. It's going to be really important. Obviously, when we talk about collaboration, communication is I think the most critical component. It's about ensuring that we are on the same page and we're aware of what's coming down the road. Do we have releases coming up? Are there updates? Are there known issues? Do we have any gaps with accessibility? Maybe we're rolling out a new release, but we're very aware that we've, maybe we're partnering with a third party vendor to have for this new component within our product. And we know that there's some accessibility issues that we're going to have to address. Then let's talk about those. Because if we don't, we're gonna miss opportunities for us to potentially even review the content to identify that there's issues, and we're not going to be on the same page about how those are going to be fixed. So, one of the questions that might guide our conversation is, what's our shared process for that? When there's going to be new documentation, when there's going to be new updates to products, how is that conversation going to happen with customers? And where are we going to talk about accessibility in those conversations? So we've got strategic collaboration, this day-to-day operational collaboration. Obviously, when we're talking about collaboration, we've got to talk about how do we build that partnership? How are we building relationships so that there's this level of trust, but also a level of accountability? So how do we set the tone for that? And so this is an example in this quick view slide of what that could look like and what happens if we don't have it. This could be really just about problem solving together. So maybe, for example, I've had conversations with vendors in the past where we have a user at our School for the Blind who has a visual impairment. She is a blind teacher. So when we're thinking about her access to platforms, her supporting digital curricular materials for her students, she needs to have full access to those. But problem solving, how to ensure that we're addressing her specific needs, that's something that really could be a win-win for a vendor as well as for us. Because if we can solve those problems together, then the vendor is going to be well posed to address those with future customers, can better tell the story of how they're improving accessibility to meet specific user needs. And obviously, it's a win for us as an organization because we are ensuring that our users, even our end users who are not, student facing content, but our end users like our staff are having their accessibility needs met. So obviously, when we don't have that transparent conversation about, here's the challenge, let's problem solve it, then I do believe we're missing some great opportunities for learning and to be transparent in our progress. And so a collaborative question that we can have in those discussions is, how's that going to work? How are we going to communicate when we face a challenge, when something doesn't go as planned, when we didn't see this coming, but here it is? How are we going to approach that? So what are our kind of processes for communicating that? And again, this is about building trust, and that's really going to happen the more transparent we can be and the more collaborative we can approach those problems. And then the last lens that this last type of collaboration that I wanted to mention is really about the information side. So this is about ensuring that, like, especially our end users have what they need to understand the full scope of accessibility of a product. How do I interact with this product? What kind of documentation is there for me to understand any accessibility issues that are being faced? How do I make sure that I know how to submit an issue if there's an issue with accessibility that I find? So, this is about that, information. So making sure that we are on the same page, and maybe even that we're drafting that information together, because you're coming from the lens of a vendor with knowledge about your product. I'm coming from the lens of an organization understanding my user needs, and coming together to collaborate around that information design, again, can be a win-win. So here's a quick view into that. Obviously, kind of just what I was saying in the previous slide, obviously, when we know about some limitations to the product, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, okay, if that's the limitation and we're setting, a roadmap to plan our improvements, then what are we going to do in the meantime? What are the available workarounds? How are we going to communicate that to our users? Otherwise, our end users aren't aware of what still needs to be addressed, and how they can work around it in the meantime. So a collaborative question for our discussions can be, how are we going to ensure that that content is comprehensive enough that we're addressing that for our end users, and that it accurately is describing any challenges that we have and our plans for fixing it. So those are kind of the four lenses. Again, we talked about strategic, we talked about operational, day-to-day, how can we collaborate around that? We talked about that important piece about just building some trust relationships to our, to kind of guide our partnership. And then this last piece about how are we working together to address accessibility for our end users. But there are definitely some things that can get in the way. And this is probably, well, I'm sure, not an exhaustive list, but these are some potential barriers that I have seen along the way when we think about these partnerships. And some of the barriers that I think are just kind of those important highlights to just bring to mind when we're thinking about collaboration and what might be getting in our way. And some of these potential barriers are kind of internal barriers that we can overcome independently, so that then we're coming to the table ready to collaborate. So some of these barriers are kind of self-enforced. Obviously, it's difficult sometimes to remove barriers on the other side. As a vendor, there's, certainly limitations that you have to removing barriers from your customers' side of the table, and vice versa. But these are some of the things that I think if we have at the forefront of our mind, we can proactively try to mitigate and remove those barriers. So let's jump in. I have a resource document, surprise, surprise, that aligns with these barriers to collaboration. Goes a little bit more, well, a lot more in depth about what this might look like and how that impacts. And then you'll see I even have some specific ways, some strategies for how you as a vendor might address that barrier. And then, of course, a lens for even our organizations, our government organizations, our educational organizations, on how they could approach and address that barrier. So the resource document obviously is the deep dive. We're going to take a look at just kind of a quick view to give you an idea of some potential strategies. So the first one is time pressure or bandwidth gaps. When I was coming up with this list, one of the things this reminded me of specifically is when I was in grad school many, many years ago. And my master's degree is in instructional technology. And our professors were talking about common barriers to effective integration of technology in education. And they used the acronym VAST, that these are the biggest barriers that we face, or the biggest challenges that we faced. And VAST stood for vision, access, support, and time. And they posed the question to us, what do you think is the biggest barrier? Is it that we lack a shared vision? Is that, our students don't have, and our teachers don't have access to the technology? Is it that we don't have that layered support in place to support us as we're using that technology and integrating it? Or is it that we lack the time that we need to truly, wrap our arms around this effective integration? And I argued that the biggest barrier was time. Because if we had more time, we'd have time to dig into, really articulating that shared vision and making it come to fruition, making sure that we're identifying opportunities to get access, that we're identifying ways to build in those layers of support. So I argued that time was the biggest barrier. So obviously that was the first barrier that I thought of as we think about potential barriers to collaboration. It's tough. We all have limited bandwidth, limited resources. In the land of education, I certainly have seen that in every aspect of my career. We just don't have enough time in the day. But without that, without opportunities for us to talk about the capacity challenges that we face, then we're also struggling to really outline what implementation is going to look like inside of that, inside of those constraints. So here's an example. If we have one of those, if we're having access with time, it might look like, for example, maybe you've got an accessibility lead who is spread across too many projects. I know on the education side of things, as an office of one for digital accessibility, this rings true for me. So we could take the word vendor out of that and just say DPI's accessibility lead is spread across too many projects. And when that happens, it's easy for things to go unaddressed because there's only so many hours in a day. So if that's happening, this example is kind of, again, through the vendor's lens. There's certainly times when that's going to be an issue on the other side too. But through this example, if this is you and you're having issues with bandwidth and time, then be transparent about that. What are the gaps? Let's talk about those early so that we can address workarounds, what's going to happen in the meantime till we get it fixed, and how will that impact our plans for implementation. And let's talk about how we can potentially adjust those so that we're on the same page about how we're going to, mitigate the risk of compliance and ensuring that our users have what they need. It's going to have to be a conversation. If we know there's issues and the issue is that we just don't have the capacity to address it right now, then let's work together to prioritize and make a game plan of how we're going to address that. The next barrier is, and this is just through Donna Murray's experiences, I've seen that it appears that sometimes vendors have that fear of accountability and potentially liability if they don't provide an accessible product. And I completely understand that. And honestly, I think on the other side, sometimes it's a challenge for state and local government organizations to be very transparent about their accessibility work because of the challenges that they're facing to get that done. So sometimes, we kind of stay under the radar and stay quiet about that accessibility piece. But in the lens of collaborative efforts between vendors and customers, we're really going to struggle with that relational collaboration piece if we're not transparent and we're not building that sense of trust between us to have those, critical conversations about, this, it is what it is. This is the current landscape, but let's talk about how we can move forward together. So if you are coming at this with the lens of, we're worried about accountability and potential liability, so the less we talk about it, potentially the better. I promise you, it's knowing that as an organization, I'm coming to the table with a need to address accessibility, then I need our potential suppliers to come to the table with that same level of transparency. So rather than out of the gate, trying to push that conversation to the side or just ignore it altogether, I would rather you acknowledge the limitations so that we can be transparent in what's the current landscape and what would that look like if we were to move forward with a contract. What capacity do you have? What capacity do we have to address that? Because otherwise, again, we're kind of hiding and minimizing potential issues that are going to have to be faced. They're going to come to the surface at some point. So instead, let's be transparent and let's talk about what your roadmap looks like. Another barrier is just the lack of internal coordination. So in a previous session, actually a couple sessions, we've talked about what are the roles and responsibilities. And when we don't have some clear cross collaboration internally, then obviously we're going to be talking about things like total communication breakdown. When this hand doesn't know what this hand is doing, it's going to be difficult to really understand and communicate with customers what's happening internally with accessibility. So here's an example. And this is kind of through the lens of like the state and local government organization. Maybe you've got an IT team and they're looking at accessibility testing for a product. But if the procurement team doesn't have that feedback, or they get the feedback, but it's too technical for the general population of the procurement team to understand, then that's not helpful. So if we don't have internal coordination in our organization, similar to you as a vendor, then we're really working in silos, and that can absolutely delay progress. We could be duplicating efforts, and obviously there could be some confusion on the game plan. So, in short, the best practice is work on that cross collaboration internally. Doing so is going to help ensure that when we're collaborating from vendor to customer, that we are internally already on the same page. It's going to be helpful to, especially if we have someone who's kind of representing the accessibility conversation. If they're coming to the table, but they don't even know internally what's been happening with accessibility, then certainly there's going to be opportunities for confusion, delays, and even potentially duplication of efforts. All right, so another barrier is just when we're talking different stories. If we've got different expectations and we don't even realize it, if we're using different terms for things, or we don't have a clear understanding of the tools that we're using, for example, for evaluating for accessibility, then we're kind of tripping over our own feet. And one of the strategies to fix this is really just about communicating clearly what we mean when when we're using certain terms, or clearly identifying what our expectations are. And so here's an example. And I've seen this sometimes, especially when I'm reviewing a VPAT or an accessibility conformance report. I'm looking to see how you've evaluated your product. And from my understanding of your VPAT, it looks like you've just done some automated testing. And through your lens, that's sufficient. But if I'm expecting you to also include manual testing and user testing, which I am, by the way, that kind of trifold approach to evaluation, then it's going to require that touch point. I'm gonna have to loop back with the vendor to say, okay, that's great. I appreciate that you've addressed testing through automated tools, but this is the other type of testing that I'm looking for. Have you done that? If so, where's the documentation? It's really an opportunity for us to not be on the same page about what our expectations are. So one of the ways to avoid that is, and I think this can happen on both sides, is create a glossary. When you're saying this, what do you mean? When we're saying VPAT, what do we really mean by a completed VPAT? Having a list of expectations within the solicitation document. What do we mean when we say we need you to be compliant with accessibility, or we need you to meet the ADA requirements? What do we mean exactly by that? So ensuring that we're addressing that clearly is one way for us to get this barrier out of the way. Let's be clear in defining our expectations for the other party, and make sure that we're using the same, that we have a clear understanding, a common understanding of vocabulary words that we're using. All right, here's another barrier. Stuff changes, right? We have leadership changes, we have product changes, we have company changes. And that's difficult when we might have new leadership that has different priorities, and maybe accessibility is shifted to be a lower priority. Maybe we have, even leadership or team what's the word, turnover, and there's just a lack of understanding and knowledge around accessibility. Um, all of these things certainly can impact not only collaboration, but just the priorities and the process for how we're going to, what our roadmap looks like, how we're going to move forward. So here's an example. Maybe your company is going through a merge, and during that merge, the whole direction of products shifts. And so if we don't already have some things in place that are kind of institutionalized, we don't really have accessibility kind of built into policy, built into our design processes, then certainly things can get lost in that translation, in that merge, in that company merge. We may struggle with our relationships with our customers, and we potentially have an opportunity to lose knowledge. So in that turnover, if we don't have, turnover in staff, or in this case, a merger, if we don't have some processes in place to ensure that there's not a keeper of technology, of accessibility knowledge, and that there are roles and responsibilities where everyone is involved, then we risk losing that. And that's going to certainly impact our collaboration. So again, one of the big things with collaboration is communication. So let's proactively talk to our customers about what this means, but also talk about it internally. What does this look like for accessibility? How are we going to move forward in this example through the merger? How are we going to ensure that we've got things in place so that we're not adding a barrier to collaboration efforts? Okay, so those were a few what I consider to be common barriers and some potential ways for us to address those proactively, so that when we come to the table, we're kind of, those are kind of some readiness pieces. When we come to the table, we're ready to talk about collaboration because we've already addressed some of these internal barriers. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of the session that, excuse me, that the federal government agencies, I'm taking a drink, that federal government agencies have been required to meet a similar accessibility requirement under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And so when I'm thinking about like DPI and all of our school districts and charter schools, and even through the broader lens of all state and local government entities, and I'm thinking about who has lived this kind of full organizational, cross agency accessibility, growth, maturity model type experiences that we could learn from, this is who I think of, because their federal government agencies have already been down this road for a while. They've had clearly defined technical standards that they've had to meet. And they've also had to do a self-assessment that they report then to Congress to say, this is where we are, this is how much we've grown over the last year. And in that self-assessment, of course, there's a corresponding, the report itself has lots of data, some kind of the short story, I guess, the summary of, the overall stats of compliance and growth with accessibility. And what I did was take that raw data and I dug deeper into it. I'm the kind of girl that you give me a project, the first thing I'm going to do is the deep dive into all the knowledge I can find. And then I say I like to synthesize my way back out of that data to kind of tell the full story. And that's kind of what I did with the Section 508 assessment. And the reason I want to bring this to your attention today is I want to share with you some findings that, especially through the open responses. So of course there were some Likert scale type questions, where are you on the scale of compliance and growth and all of that. But there were also some open-ended narrative questions. And that's where I really dug into, was that qualitative data. And these were some of the things that I gleaned from that data and wanted to share with you the things that I thought were relative to this conversation about collaboration and what was working and what wasn't. So in this slide deck, I've linked to the section 508.gov website that has all the information about the assessments and where you can find the raw data if you want to dig in. But let me just kind of share with you some of my findings. So here are some of the barriers that I found that would impact collaboration. One, and this is something we just talked about, when there's not cross-team coordination within agencies. So again, what I'm doing was looking at the qualitative data and seeing what their open responses were, because some of the questions that were asked were, what are the challenges that you face? What are some successes that you've faced? What do you need? Those kinds of things. And I would compare that to some of the quantitative data to see if they've, how did they score when it's a self-assessment, but how did they score when it came to compliance and culture of commitment to accessibility. And so putting all of those pieces together, these were my takeaways. One, there was not really a lot of collaboration going on when they didn't even internally have a good idea of roles and responsibilities. When there wasn't a structured accessibility review process. In other words, if they're out there procuring something and then they realize after implementation that there are accessibility issues, it's because there wasn't a structured process in place for how they were going to work with the vendor and ensure that the product had been reviewed for accessibility. And then another barrier was just that after the contract was signed and things were implemented, that was kind of it. The engagement with the vendor was very limited after that point. And so obviously, without that engagement, there were limited opportunities for them to collaborate and to, address things like product updates and long range plans for accessibility. So these were some of the barriers that I found in that deep dive to the data. But I also found some positive things. So again, looking at the qualitative data in conjunction with the quantitative data where they told the story of where they are in their accessibility work, these were some of the things that I saw were resulting in positive collaboration, and really not just collaboration, but also how that was impacting their compliance and their culture. Obviously, kind of in corresponding to that barrier that we just mentioned, when they had some internal cross-functional accessibility teams. And I argue that there's even a space, I think, for us to collaborate, cross-collaborate with teams from the organization and the vendor. So, getting our IT teams to collaborate from vendor to customer, not just internally. So that, that's part of the evidence that I saw as affecting collaboration positively. Another thing that I saw as a common factor was that accessibility champions had been identified and they were being leveraged. And what I mean by that is if you have all these different teams, but you kind of have a point person, someone who is identified as, especially the larger your organization or the larger your company, if you've got accessibility champions or accessibility leads within your teams who can help, kind of come together, be that steering committee, and then go back and help think about how that affects their team and tell that story to their team. Those champions can really help drive that collaboration, I think, internally as also and also externally with your customers. Another thing is when communication was proactive, then that accessibility conformance report review was improved. So again, this comes back to transparency and making sure that you understand what your customers need from that conformance report, and that an organization is able to understand what you've reported in that conformance report. So the more we can talk about that, the better suited we are, I think, to collaboration. And then the last thing, this was interesting to me. Um, Collaboration can be really through the lens of supporting each other with training needs. Now, of course, we've got time constraints that may be a barrier for this, but if I have a vendor who says, you know what, this is the first time we've really been diving deep into accessibility, and this is a space maybe specific to keyboard accessibility. You know, this is a space that we're really struggling with, and we're trying to build capacity around really understanding what that technical requirement is. If we've got that knowledge, then let's share that. And so one of the things that I saw in the Section 508, my findings in that deep review, was that in some instances, organizations were supporting the vendor with technical assistance, with, you know, kind of light training, or at least pointing them in the direction of some resources to help them. And of course, that's going to make that, you know, that relationship, that relational collaboration piece even stronger. So these are some of my takeaways from that deep dive. And again, I was thinking through the lens of who else has lived this work at the organization level, and thinking about how our federal government agencies have already been down this road for a few years. I wanted to kind of see what lessons we could learn from them. So those are my findings specific to today's conversation. And then kind of the last piece that I want to talk about today is maybe you as a vendor are working with customers and you're realizing that you've got customers who haven't really thought about accessibility to this point. I argue that oftentimes when we don't know what we don't know, it's not because we don't want to move forward with removing barriers for our users. It's not that we don't want to move forward to make sure that our services and programs are accessible to everyone. It's that we didn't know. We don't know what we don't know. And so if you are really moving forward with accessibility, then I challenge you to lead the way as a vendor when it comes to collaboration. And so what I have in the next few slides are just some ideas on ways to do that. And I even have some like simple quotes for you to pose to your customers to kind of start that conversation. Okay, so the first thing is, as a way that you can lead as a vendor, is to start talking about accessibility from the beginning. So in your, sales documentation, when you're replying to an RFP, if they haven't asked about accessibility, share about it anyway. Like, let that be how you do business. So, and let it be not just about checking that compliance checkbox, but tell the story about how you're building that in along the way. And so then, in that procurement or in that implementation, you can tell that story about, hey, this is a core part of how we design and deliver our platform. So if we can help you on your side to be thinking about accessibility, we can support your efforts in that. Another important piece I think that you can do as a vendor to lead the way for collaboration is to make sure that you're framing accessibility as a value add. Now, one of the arguments that I hear often when it comes to accessibility is, well, we don't have any users with disabilities, so this isn't really a priority for us. Well, one, you don't know who has disabilities that might be your end users. The statistics show that 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. Some of those may be invisible. Some of them may not be shared with their employers or with vendors. So 1, we can't make that assumption. But 2, this is about universal design, because oftentimes accessibility, while it's essential for some, can be helpful for everyone. So tell that story, tell about how it's a value add, not just for, certainly most importantly for our users with disabilities, but not just for them. It could be helpful for everyone. Another thing to do is offer resources. For example, if you've got some guidance on accessibility, or you've got an FAQ that is specific to accessibility about your products, or even just about accessibility in general, then share that with your customers. Lead the way in helping them really understand the what and the why and the how of accessibility. And so you can pose that through conversations about, if you're struggling with building capacity internally with accessibility, we've got some resources we'd love to share with you. Even if it's you turn in your VPAT as part of your solicitation documents and they don't know what it is, then help them through that. Help them understand, okay, well, we'd love to walk through this with you to help you understand where we are with accessibility. Another one is just, talk about how things have worked in other partnerships with other customers you've had. So of course that could be, through general terms, or if there's opportunities for you to kind of share successes with other customer partners that you could replicate in this new partnership, then tell that story. So the example I have here is, we've previously with some other customers, we found it helpful for us to sit down and think about your users' needs and how we might need to address accessibility. Can we put that in our game plan for rollout? So just an opportunity for you to kind of leverage your previous partnerships and what worked well with them. And another thing to do is to really gauge readiness. So again, you're being the leader here. This kind of comes back to my original conversation when I started this section. Let's don't assume that they don't care, and let's don't even assume that they don't know. Maybe the conversation just hasn't come up. Maybe it's not, bubbled up as a priority yet. So let's don't make assumptions, but let's, I think there's some questions we can pose to kind of start that conversation to kind of see where they are. So we can ask, we haven't really talked about accessibility yet. Do you have any processes that we need to be aware of so that we're on the same page? Here's our ACR. Would you like us to kind of go through that together with you? And that can kind of give you a better lens into what they know and what their accessibility progress is. And another one is just, this kind of relates to some of the things we've already talked about today. When there's an opportunity for us to collaborate on creating some information, whether that's onboarding guides or especially if we've got like training materials where we're going to be doing some training with their end users, then if we can co-create those, then we know we're addressing their specific needs. So pose it that way. Even if they don't bring it up, then you bring it up. How can, we'd love to collaborate with you on this documentation. We'd love to hear kind of from you what your user journeys are and how we can make sure we're meeting those needs and making sure that we're creating accessible experiences for them. So those are, this is my last example of one way that you can lead the work is, and you've heard me say this so many times in these previous webinars, how, be as transparent as possible. We need to own it. Because it's going to come to the surface at some point. If we are kind of pushing the accessibility conversation to the side because we really don't want to highlight the challenges that we're facing, I promise you, this conversation is going to become more and more important over time, and it's going to bubble up to the surface. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can model that openness. And one way I think for us to pose that is to say, here's where we are. This is the true story of our current landscape. This is what got us to the accessibility journey. It was after we designed our product, but now we're realizing the importance of accessibility. So here's our remediation plan, and here's how we're building capacity so that we don't face these challenges in the future. And we want you to partner with us and giving us feedback on that and helping design that roadmap. So These are ways that you can lead the conversations. You can be the leader in brokering these collaborative relationships. And so I hope you'll take these challenges to step up and be a mover and a shaker. You lead the way in these collaborative efforts. And this is a word that I just kept coming back to. And all of this work that I've done for this full webinar series, and even before that, honestly, was synergy. This idea that the sum of the whole is more than the individual parts. And that's what I mean when I say this is a win-win. Because the more that we can collaborate, the better prepared you are to meet the true needs of your end users and of your customers. And then as an organization, the better prepared I'm going to be to ensure that I'm procuring solutions that really meet the needs of my users. And the more that we can come together to have those conversations, I believe the more powerful the impact can be. I do believe that these types of partnerships are bigger than the individual pieces, and the lasting impacts we can have, not only for future products or future end users, but just the full landscape of accessibility will be, I believe it'll have a snowball effect. So this synergistic relationship is a win-win. And I hope that I challenge you to step into that space and think about ways that you can collaborate even more with your customers. So if you've followed along with if you've joined any of our other webinars, you've seen a picture of my daughter. And today I was able to update this webinar's picture of Olivia because she went to the prom this weekend, her first prom. So this is my my daughter Olivia, and she is my personal why. And I like to include this in presentations because I feel like these user stories are so critical to really understanding what barriers people face and how we can kind of give a lens of empathy to our conversation around accessibility. Olivia is going to be 20 next month and has multiple disabilities. You can see she's in a wheelchair. She has cognitive disabilities as well. And I've been down this road for nearly 2 decades. And there's still so much for me to learn. If one thing I've learned is that we know so little about the brain. And so my challenge has been with we call her our mystery girl. My challenge has been not only as a parent, but also professionally to remove as many barriers as I can for her. And that's the challenge that I'm giving to you is find your why. Find that user story, whether it's very personal to you or if you need kind of a litmus test for your work, then consider Olivia. How are you removing barriers so that Olivia and her peers, as well as just all users, are not facing barriers to accessibility when they're using your products? Because that's your end goal. You want to provide solutions that meet needs. So I challenge you to think about, to come up with your why. And if you can't think of a personal story, then here's your Olivia to put in the back of your mind. She's certainly the driving force for all of my efforts, both professionally and of course as a mama. All right, so the last thing is just wanted to share my website, and I'll put this link into the chat. And sorry, currently I'm logged in to make edits, so that's why it may look a little different on my end. But I just wanted to point out specifically the procurement section. There's lots of resources embedded in here. I was going to mention the YouTube playlist is down here in the bottom left-hand corner if you'd like to access that. But the procurement section is where I have the full list of resources for suppliers. Now, I encourage you to take a look at the other resources above that, which are more suited for state and local government and specifically for education organizations. But I have been adding all of these resources that I've been developing for suppliers. So this is kind of a one-stop shop for you if you want to go back and reference any of the materials from the webinar series. All right. And for my friends who have attended other webinars who have realized that Donna Murray has trouble keeping on track of time and keeping her presentation under an hour, look at me. I'm like right at the hour and almost completely finished. It only took me to the 5th webinar to be able to use my time wisely. Okay, so just to wrap up, this is part 5. This links to all the presentations from before. Today was about collaborating. And next week, if you are an ed tech vendor, I encourage you to join next week because we're going to add another lens to the conversation and talk about student-facing materials, because there are a few additional things that we need to consider, including some alternative formats for instructional materials. And so if you are an ed tech vendor, I encourage you to join us next week, or at least make sure you come back and visit the YouTube channel to find that recording in a couple of weeks. All right, that's it. I will pull up the main slide again so you can access the shortcut link if you need it. I'll put that link in the chat again. And thanks for joining. If there's anything I can do to support you, my email is in the slide deck. And thank you so much for your efforts to collaborate with your customers.